So I want to ask Vikram how he got the courage after such successful novels to move into a new genre, and why?
Well, I think mainly happened because I got stuck on the fiction I was working on. And not stuck in that awful writer's block kind of way, but sometimes you reach a point in when you're writing a story, you have the characters, you have the location, but you don't quite know what's going to happen next. And usually when that happens, I just take a couple of weeks off and I read a lot and watch movies and listen to music, and then at some point in the shower, everything clicks together and then you know what's going to happen next. But this time, for reasons that I can't quite decipher myself, I thought I would use this little gap time usefully to finally write an essay that I've been thinking about for years, which is to try and explain the culture of programmers to outsiders, right? To people who are not in the tech industry, because our world and our beings have been so profoundly transformed by programming, but most of us don't have a very good idea of what it feels like within that subculture. So at that point I thought I was writing a short, glossy magazine essay which should run to about 30 pages, and then 2 weeks and I would be done with it. And then 3 years later, my wife Melanie suddenly said, you've written a book. And that was quite amazing. So I sort of just wandered into it, and it grew into something much bigger than I had originally happened, which often happens, I think.
One of the things I enjoyed the most about the book was your description of how poetry and the art of writing and the art of being an artist is linked to programming and code writing. Can you describe the similarities between writing code and writing great literature?
Right. So when I started working on the thing, I realized I didn't have a way to enter the subject, right? How do you talk about programming for people who are not programmers? And then it occurred to me that just like fiction writers or poets, programmers spend the whole day struggling with language, right? Because what you're trying to do is to create a text that has an engineering function. It's going to tell the machine to do something, but it also has a human audience. And in fact, in the early 80s, a very famous computer scientist named Donald Knuth told us that what you're doing, the writing for the machine, is only incidental. Who you're really writing for is all the programmers who will read your code in the future, right? Because code is always needing to be fixed, extended, debugged, right? So at some point in the future, some other group of people are going to come and look at the text that you put together. And the timelines can be very long. Approximately 90% of the world's financial transactions are processed by code that was written in the 60s, right? So you're talking about 50 years later, somebody's going to try and come and look at this massive text and they're going to try and make sense out of it. So because of that, programmers value expressiveness, they value clarity, they value, in fact, beauty, because there are ways of writing code that are very elegant. So in the same way, perhaps, that mathematicians or physicists talk about the beauty of an equation, there's also an aesthetic aspect to the code that you read on a page. It's sort of got to try and tell you a story of what it's trying to do. And it becomes also very important because some of these software objects that we're building are immensely large. So there was a 2008 distribution of Linux, which is an open source operating system, that comprises 200 million lines of code, right? So at that size, even trying to hold all of that in your head and to try and understand it means that the architecture itself has to reveal intent, right? That it's got to be elegantly put together so that in the future, when somebody wants to change it, you can pull out one piece and replace it with another. And if you don't do all of this, you can end up with software systems that run, but nobody really understands how they run. And I'm not making this up. The US Pentagon's salary software was written in the 60s. It makes mistakes all the time. It underpays people or overpays them. They're very slow to react when you tell them to fix things. But they can't fix it because nobody really understands how it works. The documentation for these like 7 million lines of COBOL code that was written in the 60s has been lost long ago. There have been hundreds of programmers who worked on this for years, so it's like this patchwork of objects. And you might ask, well, why don't you just replace the thing from the ground up? And the answer is that it will cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and at the end, you still might not have a system that actually works. Right? So under the glossy surface of your browser, there are some things that are awful biological looking messes, right? They're just like dense, and there's archaeological layers that go back 40 years, and nobody really understands how they all fit together. So anyway, that's a long way of coming back to this idea that I had, that maybe this would be a way to enter the book, that what programmers do is construct language in a way that is also trying to search for beauty. And in fact, because of this, in recent decades, programmers have been fond of making the claim that they are artists, right? So one of the famous expressions of this is an essay by a guy called Paul Graham, who's a very successful programmer and now venture capitalist in San Francisco. And he's written this essay called Hackers and Artists, in which he said that hackers and artists are the two most alike groups of people that he knows. Right? So I thought I would sort of investigate that, and that's how the structure of the book came about, in that it investigates, on the one hand, how programming works and what programmers think is beautiful, and then on the other hand, how literary language works and how it produces its effects.
Let's talk about literary language. When you talk about that, you talk about some famous, not so famous, but amazing Sanskrit poets from the 9th and 10th century, and what they tell us about language and what makes writing beautiful.
Right.
Talk a little bit how you found them and what they tell us.
Okay, so this is going to be, it's a slightly complex history to talk about, but we have to start even further back than the 8th and 9th centuries. In that, right from very early Vedic times, language has been a central Indian concern, right? Because in the Vedas themselves are interesting texts. There's wisdom texts which are revealed to men and women who have the ability, the spiritual ability, to hear this language that is part of the structure of the universe, right? So that the Vedas are, formally speaking, in terms of the people that originated them, they weren't writing these texts. They're unauthored texts. They just heard this and they wrote it down. And so what's also interesting about these texts is that it's not just the syntax that's important. You don't just try and preserve the order of the words. Every tone, every intonation, every rhythm has to be perfectly preserved. So very early, there was this tremendously sophisticated linguistic scientific tradition that was developed, which reached a kind of height in about 500 BCE, when the grammarian Panini published his famous book called the Ashtadhyayi, which literally means 8 chapters. And it's a very short book. You can print it out in about 40 pages of normal size text. And it's a grammar for Sanskrit, of the Sanskrit language. Except that when I say grammar, I bet what pops up in our heads is the kind of thing that I learned English from in 2nd grade, right? Where you have these verb declensions and you learn them by heart, right? Those are paradigmatic grammars. They give you examples and then you take those examples and apply them to other forms of language. Panini's grammar is not like that at all, right? And what it really is 3,976 rules. And each rule is very short, usually about 2 or 3 words long, written in this immensely compressed formal Sanskrit, which also has a meta language built in. So, in other words, he can refer to the language in itself. And the way that it works is that when you want a word, you take a verb root, like for instance, kri, right? Which is the verb root from which, after transformations, we get karta, right? We get karma. So anything that has to do with making or doing comes from that verb root. And the way that you produce the words is that you pop it into the Ashtadhyayi, and that form sets off certain rules, which in turn set off other rules, right? And these rules can be recursive, and any programmer today will recognize these as string transformation rules. In other words, they operate on that first thing that you drop in, and they transform it in ordered steps through it, and out pops at the end another word. So there are rules for producing words, and there's rules for combining words, making compound words, there's rules for producing sentence. So what this thing really is, it's not a traditional grammar, it's an algorithm, right? It's a tremendously complex system that produces language. And there's a very well-known Sanskrit scholar named S.D. Joshi who pointed out that because of this, Sanskrit is in a sense an infinite language, in that there's an infinity of possible grammatically correct Sanskrit words that you can make up from those roots and from other words. We just don't know if they've ever been used, right? So it's a machine. It's a little machine, and it has been compared to the Turing machine. So it has an interesting career in both within India and the West, in that within India, what it does to Sanskrit is that it makes Sanskrit a formal language. And by formal, I mean an artificial language that very strictly obeys a system of rules, right? And so because of this, Sanskrit has the interesting quality about it that it hasn't really changed in 2,500 years, right? So if you've suffered through reading Beowulf in the original text, you know how much a language can drift. But if you had a Pandit in Varanasi today write a grammatically correct Sanskrit letter, and you time machined it back 2,000 years, they would be able to read it. They might not understand, if you refer to Antarjal, internet, they might not understand what that means, right? Because of the contextual meaning. But grammatically and syntactically, they would be able to make sense out of it. In the West, Panini's Ashtadhyayi gets discovered in the 18th centuries during the first decades of the discovery of the Indian scholastic tradition by the West. It gets taken to Germany, it gets translated, and then makes its way into Europe, and becomes the basis for much of modern linguistic science. Right? So Ferdinand de Saussure, who we all know as the father of structural linguistics, was a Sanskrit professor. Leonard Bloomfield, who set the direction of a lot of most of the research in America in the 20th century, was also a Sanskrit professor. Noam Chomsky, who's had a huge influence on programming languages through his Chomsky hierarchy, has said in many places of the debt that he owes to Panini. So what happens in the 50s in the computer world is that programmers are trying to get away from talking to machines in ones and zeros, right? Because that's very hard to understand. So they're trying to create formal languages that are more English-like, right? And so in order to construct such a language, it has to be very regular, because that's the only way a computer can parse it, right? You and I can understand by context what something means. A computer can't do that. So they go looking to linguistics for ideas of how to construct language, and what they find there is Panini's system transformed into another set of formal systems. So in some sense, the world that we live in today has been constructed by this grammar from 2,500 years ago. And the form that most contemporary Indian computer languages are notated and generated by, it's called the Bacchus-Nor form. A programmer in the mid-60s wrote to the Journal of Computer Machinery in the States and suggested that it should actually be called Panini-Nor form. Because Panini was the originator of the system, which then other people took or independently discovered and then put together to make computer language happen. So that's another long way of saying that Sanskrit, it seemed to me, was an interesting language in which to explore the idea of literary beauty, right? Because at the same time, there's this search for precision and exactness. There's a huge tradition developing also of kavya. And the first people who tried to understand this, or to answer the question, what is it that makes poetic language beautiful? The earliest responses to this were all formalist, right? So in other words, some people argued that figures of speech was what made language beautiful. So we can say that Shakespeare's language is beautiful because it is so rich with imagery and figures of speech. Other people said, no, style is important. And for instance, Hemingway, for instance, doesn't have figures of speech, but there's something about his writing, its rhythms, that makes it beautiful. So it was very, the whole tradition of criticism was very concerned with the formal constructions of language. And then in the 8th century, this guy comes along named Anandvardhana, who says, no, this is you guys haven't figured this out. It's not formal qualities that makes poetry poetry. It's something else altogether. And what he says is, it's suggestion, right? And he describes this, he calls it dhvani, which literally means reverberation or vibration. And so his idea is that what happens is that the poet works not through denotation but by connotation, by suggesting things, right? And what he does is he takes very famous poems from his time and analyzes them in terms of this idea and shows you how they work, right? So maybe I should use one of his examples. So there's a couple of very famous examples that he uses in his text.
Do you want the one on Ram? I have that one.
Oh, no, the ones right before that.
Okay.
We'll come to Ram. So this is one example. This is a Prakrit poem from the pre-8th century, and this is a woman speaking, and what she says is, "O holy monk, wander without fear. That little dog was killed today by him, that violent lion living in the thickets on the banks of the Godavari River." Right? So this is a woman who's speaking to a wandering monk who's come looking for alms, and what she's telling him, you can wander through the village without fear because that violent lion who lives by the river killed the dog that used to bother you. So Anandvardhana's point about this is that, what is she really saying? What is she really trying to do? And he points out that what she's really trying to do is to keep the monk away from the thickets by the river, which is where she meets with her lover. Right? So that, and none of that is in the denotative content of this language. It's all suggestive. Right? So here's another one. This is again a woman speaking. "Mother-in-law sleeps down there, and I hear. Look while day remains, O traveler. Do not, blind in the night, lie down in my bed." Right? So what Anandvardhana says again here is that, look, what does she really mean? What is she really trying to do? Is she really telling him to stay away from the bed? No, she's actually issuing an invitation. She's saying, look, that's precisely where I sleep, and that's where mother-in-law sleeps, and this is how you're supposed to find my way there in the middle of the night. Right? So again, the theorist Anandvardhana and his successors in the dhvani tradition love this because what she's actually doing is the exact opposite of what she's saying. Right? So this is this idea of suggestion, that you talk without talking, you speak without speaking. Therefore then dhvani occurs when you use suggestion like this. And if you've ever taken a creative writing class, you've probably been told in the first or second class, show, don't tell, right? That famous dictum. And so you can think of this as an 8th or 9th century Indian version of show, don't tell, although these guys would have said, suggest, don't tell. And so starting with Anandvardhana, what happens is that an entire tradition of literary criticism gets developed around this idea of suggestion, of dhvani. And it's interesting, I mean, you can think of this in kind of opposing ways. So there's this search for clarity and denotative meaning, right? You want language to say exactly what it means. But language is always slippery. The minute you speak, all kinds of meanings accumulate around that. And so what these guys do is celebrate the multiplicity of language, right? That by saying very simple things, you can suggest a million things. And this is one idea that they keep repeating, is that dhvani is endless, right? That the denotative meaning of a sentence can be exhausted, but the suggestive meaning of a sentence can never be exhausted, because it changes with every reader, with every listener. So what you bring to the text as a reader influences what dhvani you experience, and therefore you can't ever predict what somebody is going to read into your work.
You also talk about, when talking about dhvani, about how whether something has dhvani and resonates depends on your experience, but also the subconscious or unconscious experience of a culture or a world. What do you think of that?
Well, so what happens with this idea of dhvani is that people develop it in very interesting ways. So about 100 years after Anandvardhana comes along this amazing polymath named Abhinavagupta. And Abhinav Gupta is one of the great philosophers of the Indian tradition. He's a Kashmiri, as was perhaps Anand. He's a Shaivite. He's, by his contemporaries, considered to be a realized yogic master, and his great masterwork is on tantric philosophy. But he's also very interested in aesthetics and the experience of beauty, and he's very interested in the psychology of beauty, right? So the question that he addresses most directly is, if you and I are watching the Game of Thrones and are seeing something extraordinarily gruesome happening on the screen, and some of you must have seen those reaction videos on YouTube, right? Like from the Red Wedding, for instance, right, of people watching it, and people jump out of their seats and they clutch their heads and they close their eyes, and then they express pleasure, right? So his question is, why is this happening? How can this happen? And his answer is that what happens in the fictional experience is that you experience the emotion that is suggested by the occurrence in the text or on the stage, but you know that it's not real, right? So you don't attach your own ego or your own self to it. You don't say, this is happening to me, this is happening to my friend, this is happening to my enemy. So what's happening is that you're actually physically experiencing the emotions that are being suggested by the text, but you're able to view them from a distance, as it were, right? From an objective distance, and therefore then experience them as pleasure. So that what his famous line about this is that what is enjoyed in the savoring of poetry is consciousness itself. Right? So what happens is that during the normal sort of movement of life, we are so distracted and we are so caught up in the ego experience of saying, I'm hurt by this, or I'm going to try and hurt you by doing this, that we don't realize what a miracle it is to actually be conscious. And so what happens in the aesthetic experience is very much like what happens during the yogic experience. Right? So that if you meditated, what are you supposed to do? Well, you're supposed to let the emotions and the images float up and then not experience them in an egoistic way, right? Let them, release them, let them go. So in his view, it's not even, I actually misspoke. He doesn't say that it's a similar experience. He argues that it is exactly the same experience, right? That the aesthetic experience is what is easily available to us as opposed to the harsh yogic path that you have to go through to actually experience this kind of divine pleasure, right? And since he's a Shaivite, he finally connects it to this experience of the universe which comes through meditation and so forth. So he's very interested in the psychology, and what he also talks about, interestingly, is that every human being has an infinite store of what he calls latent traces stored up within us. So that things from the past lives and from what has happened to you in this life get stored up. You might have forgotten them consciously, but they're still there. So what happens in the experience of fiction is that certain of those memories are brought alive again, and the emotions connected with them are brought alive again by the experience of the fiction, but you're not attaching to them, right? And so it's a very interesting, very sophisticated psychological take on the experience of aesthetic pleasure and how fiction works and how poetry works.
Eliot draws on this and thinks about it and studied Sanskrit too. Tell us a little about that.
Well, we know that he studied Sanskrit for 2 years and was immensely confused and in some ways retreated from it because to somebody trained in the Western traditions of philosophy, people like Abhinav Gupta are very foreign and kind of frightening, right? Because they're immensely sophisticated, but they always want to connect something with whatever philosophy they're investigating with a vision of the universe, with a vision of the moral, right? So and it's a bad translation, in some sense they want to deal with the spiritual as they do philosophy. So, it's very disconcerting for somebody like Eliot to discover, and so what he says about his experience with the Indian tradition is that he said that I felt like that there were these immensely sophisticated thinkers, and I'm quoting him almost exactly, I think, he says that make modern European philosophers look like schoolboys, right? But in order to understand what they're really after, I would have to change myself completely. And therefore he steps back. He doesn't want to experience that change. So his notions, Eliot's notions about how poetry works, right? And he talks about this in one of his essays where he says that in order to produce emotion in an art, what you have to do is to show the reader or the experiencer a certain set of actual physical occurrences or objects that will raise the emotion within the reader that you want them to experience. Right? So that sounds awfully close to Anand Vardhana and Abhinav Gupta. So I mean, it's very tempting even for me as an Indian to say, well, Elliot, you old dog, you just read these guys and then you stole them and didn't credit them with these ideas. We don't really know if he did or not. And so the argument could be made, it's just great minds thinking alike, separated by centuries.
What did you conclude? Is code writing an art? Are code writers or programmers artists? And why or why not?
Well, I'm giving away the game, as it were, but finally, so there's Paul Graham's claim that hackers are artists because we make beautiful things, right? And we attempt to search for beauty. And so I want to finally find myself resisting that very strongly, because although you're making beautiful things when you're constructing code, the reasons why that is those pieces of code are beautiful are very different from what happens during poetry, right? So for example, code has to be absolutely denotated. It has to say exactly what it means and nothing else, right? And if you introduce ambiguity into code, you're introducing the potential for crashes and disasters. And since we live in a world run by algorithms now, those kinds of ambiguities, you can actually kill people with them. And people have died because of bugs that are introduced because the code didn't have enough clarity. Whereas poetry delights in purposeful ambiguity, right? The whole idea of dhwani is that you say one thing but you suggest 15 other things, right? That you suggest, you make alive within the viewer's or the reader's mind all of that immense store of memories that we all carry around within us. So that's one way in which it's different. Code has to finally compile, right? So if you write code that is syntactically incorrect and you try and compile it, which is the preparatory step towards actually offering it to the machine to actually work, the compiler, which is a special piece of software, will say, no, you can't do this, I don't understand, right? Whereas Abhinav Gupta points out that in poetry, you can get rid of correctness, right? It doesn't matter whether your language is syntactically correct or not, as long as you create dhwani. And in fact, he suggests you can actually get rid of meaning altogether, right? So alliterative sounds, music, right, is capable of producing aesthetic responses and pleasure where meaning doesn't exist anymore. There is no denotation at all, right? So I think in that way it also differs. And I think finally the processes that artists and writers and programmers go through are very different. And I can speak about myself because I've done both. Programming is like solving little puzzles, right? Because what you try and do is break down the functionality that you're trying to create into little pieces, and then you write little pieces of code that do exactly one thing, right? And you can test it and to see whether it's doing that thing or not. And it's very pleasing, right? You try for a long time to make it do something, and then this green check mark appears on your screen when you run your test, and hey, it works. That's great. And then you compose it together with other small pieces, and again test it to see if it still works. Whereas in poetry, you have no idea whether it works or not, right? And because your true reader might exist 100 years in the future. And as these people point out, you can't control the response of the reader. You can't predict it, right? And so this idea of the perfect reader who exists somewhere in the future is, in some sense, a very ambiguous one, right? So because of this, I think it's very different. And for me, if I spend a day trying to write fiction, then turning at the end of the day to write some code is such a relief, because it's a very finite world in which I know exactly what I'm trying to do, and I know whether it works or not. And so it's a relief from the ambiguities of the other kind of writing.
Many of us in the audience are writers. Tell us a little about your writing process. What you find hardest, what's most challenging, and how you overcome those obstacles.
I think being in the beginning or middle of a project is always the worst thing, right? Because at least when I start, I have a character or a couple of characters, I have a location, I have a mood, but I have no idea what the rest of the damn thing is. And the only way I can discover it is by writing it, right? So I painfully construct 400 words each day, which moves the scene forward a little bit and a little bit. And then, like I said earlier, at some points you're like sitting there baffled because you've got all these things together and you don't know what's going to happen next. So it's a process that requires a lot of trial and error, and your first draft is always kind of ugly and has huge holes in it, and it has branches that started but went nowhere, so you abandon them. And then through like 20, 30 revisions, you slowly start to appear, to get closer and closer to the thing, the mood that you had in your head when you started. So, sorry, go ahead.
No, so you've written a 900-page book, Sacred Games. What was the process of writing this? What was your vision when you started? What did you think you were doing?
I started with the bunker scene, right? So there's a gangster inside a bunker who's barricaded himself out, and there's a cop outside, and they're talking to each other over the intercom, and it's a very hot day. That's all I had. I didn't know who the gangster was. I kind of knew who the cop was, but apart from that, I didn't know anything, right? And so then, literally by writing it, by figuring out what the gangster says next, it leads you a little further and a little further. And then I just kept writing, and also since it's a kind of a crime novel, it's a policier, it's a thriller, it's a very plotty book, right? So I would figure out on page 400 of the manuscript, well, in order to have this scene work, I should have planted something on page 200. But it was very clear to me that if I started going back to correct that, I would get caught up in these endless loops. So what I was doing was making little notes on a separate file to myself and just pushing forward. So when I got through the first draft, I met Melanie, my now wife, when I was about halfway through the book. And she said, "Where are you in the book?" And I said, "Halfway." And 2 years ago, later, she would say, "Well, where are you now?" "Halfway, I think." So the day that I finally wrote the final words, she was asleep, and I walked up to her. This was in the afternoon. I tugged on her toe, and I said, "Hey, I finished." And she said, "Finish what?" But I couldn't show it to her because it was so full of holes and so disorganized. And so then I put it aside for a month and then went back to it. And it took me a good 5-6 months to get the second draft in a shape that I could actually show it to her. And then there were many other drafts after that.
So there's a hero and heroine in the book. Did you know that those were the two characters when you started the book that you would focus on? Or did the heroine just evolve?
She just appeared, yeah. So once I figured out that there was a dead woman in the bunker along with the gangster, then who's a survivor? Oh, she has a sister. And then I write about the sister, and then 6 months later, oh, this is interesting. Sartaj and she seem to have some chemistry. So let's see where this goes, right? So it's half constructed and half found, and it can be immensely frustrating. It's a grind, because you have to have faith, and then there's inevitably in the middle of a project there's a loss of faith. You have no idea whether what you're doing has any value, whether it has a shape, whether you're really going to discover solutions to all these questions that you've been putting on the side, and then you just have to somehow power yourself through that. And Melanie's working on her second novel now, and she's at somewhere in that stage, and we talk about this, the grind of doing it, and there is absolutely no way of avoiding that. You have to live it, and then be in the middle of it, and then just go through.
This ends up not just being a great, riveting story with lots of really compelling characters who you get really attached to, but it also ends up being a book that tells you about all the conflicts going on in India right now. So there's interspersed between the riveting scenes are scenes that take you back to the background of this person who ended up in Mumbai in this conflict. Did you know you were going to do that, and how did you do that?
No, not at all. So when I had that first scene, I thought I was writing a tidy little 250-page thriller, right? There's a dead gangster inside a bunker. 250 pages later, we find out why he's dead, right? And the immediate impulse for writing the book was, everyone who's here lived through the 80s and 90s and the early 2000s in the city, and you remember the level of violence that was then existing, right? People were getting machine gunned at petrol stations. My dad and I were driving home to Lokhandwala one afternoon, and suddenly we heard automatic fire echoing around the buildings. So my family is many of us are in the film industry, so I've grown up on the periphery of that. And so people that I knew and was friends with were getting threats. A couple of them were shot at, and one was actually wounded. So I guess my curiosity was, what is the shape of this and why is this happening on my street, right? So I start writing that story, right, like of violence on the streets of Bombay. And then I'm sitting 2 years later in the office of a pretty senior cop in North Bombay and trying to figure out this one shootout that happened. And he says, you're never going to understand this until you go to Delhi and talk to X, Y, and Z. And I say, oh, yeah, that's probably true, because it becomes clear at some point that organized crime, in many ways, cannot exist without the okay or the willing, to some extent, some willing cooperation of the establishment, right? I mean, that's the very nature of organized crime. There's an exchange of value that happens between the political structures that are in place and between these guys. And obviously one of the ways, and this is like very commonplace knowledge now, one of the ways in which the gangs or the companies have operated is that they're very valuable to various intelligence agencies around the subcontinent, right? How do you move material over a border? Well, what better than to have your friendly neighborhood smuggler do it for you, right? You need some really dirty thing done that you need deniability for, right? So what do? You farm it out to your favorite gangster, right? Who puts a plan into operation and then it has nothing to do with it. So that's what he was suggesting, is that what was happening locally in Bombay on my street was connected in very concrete ways to stuff that was happening on a much larger scale, right? And then, you know, if you're talking about politics in today's India or anywhere in the world, you're also talking about religion, you're talking about media. So suddenly, like what I thought was a very simple sort of linear story started to have all these connections that spread. And then the interesting problem finally was, how do you hold all of this together and give it a shape so that it actually constructs itself in a kind of comprehensible way.
So how did you finally bring it together? Because when you read the whole book, it all seems to come together. All of the characters linked to big conflicts in India, from the Maoists to Pakistan to Kashmir. Did it require many rewrites?
Yeah. In fact, I can tell you almost the exact number, 29 drafts. And I know that because
29 drafts of a 900-page book.
No, yeah. And I'm not saying they were all like incredible. I mean, each one was a complete rewrite. So as you get further into the process, once you have the larger structure down, then you find yourself making more sort of chapter level changes, and then you come down to paragraphs and sentences, and then you're listening for sounds, and you're listening for how a scene moves across the page. So the finer work starts to happen at the later stages. But the reason I know this number is because I try and teach creative writing, fiction writing to students, and I try and pound this into them that nobody can make art on the first attempt. It's only on the 60th attempt at the same thing that you'll actually get somewhere close to beauty, right? So I have this slide that I made in a PowerPoint thing that I show them of all the folders of 0 through 29 of the book, right? And as far as I know, that's how everyone does it, right? There's no instant pathway or secret key that you can hand somebody and then they know how to write a book.
Yeah, no, when people ask me how I write, I always say shitty first drafts. Editors look kind of nervous when they hear that, but it's true. You have to get something down on paper and begin. So we're going to take questions now. Does anyone have a question for Vikram? Otherwise, I will ask a question. Let me pass this. Okay, I guess I won't pass. I'll repeat it. Okay, I won't repeat the question, I'll let him answer.
So, it started a very long time ago. So when I was in graduate school writing my first novel, there's a big part of it. So it's a novel about colonialism, essentially, about the clash of cultures. the first generation of people who grow up under British rule, and the protagonists, a couple of them are people whose father is British and whose mother is a Rajput. So that was an interesting thing to think about, is like, how do you represent those pre-colonial characters? Like, what is the universe that they live in? And one of them was a poet who later becomes a revolutionary. So I was trying to think about, like, what is his system of poetry? How does he think about it?